Hello, and welcome to the shed. Today's video we're going to be making this little dovetail jig. Hope you enjoy. I made this one completely out of plywood, but today we're going to be using a little bit of jarrah for the top piece and a little bit of plywood again. And the other thing is, just so you know where we're starting out with these, is it's imperative that you have these pieces square all the way around, because we're going to be using them for doing referencing on obviously joinery. We want to make sure that these are actually dead square to start with. More important on the top piece, because that is going to be our square line once the jig is done. So you want to make sure that these two lines are parallel, because we're going to be using both sides. So I've had both these pieces on the shooting board and I've squared them completely around so they're all square to each other's sides. So if I come on like that, it's square, this way it's square, that way it's square. So they're square all around. And as you can see, we're going to end up putting a little dovetail right in the front here. So we're going to start with marking out the tail. Just like usual with a dovetail, we want to put this thickness on here so we get the correct thickness dovetail on this piece just here. So in order to do that, I'm going to sit it on top here, my wheel marking gauge, and I'm going to drop that down and then lock it down. And if we have a look here, this should be the exact thickness. If it's not, and mine has moved slightly, if you've got one of these double gauge with the wheel here, you can actually just unlock that top one and just move it slightly until it matches where you want, which I have there now. And then with these ones I like to pull that back, and that's making sure that everything's held exactly where you want it. So we then want to grab the top edge of our piece that we're putting our dovetail on and mark this line all the way around. I know it's a little fiddly, so take your time, get it right. We want a nice deep line on here because it's going to make it easier to reference later on, especially on these sides here. It's going to make it easier for us to get our chisel in here later on and reference that. To mark out the tail, I'm going to be using these two little squares that you've probably seen me use in the past. This one's just a standard little small square. This one happens to be a 1/6 dovetail square. So to make this, you kind of need something to get the angle, or you can just eyeball the angle if that's something that you want to do. You can have a specific step in of how far in you want to come in and how big you want to make this dovetail. But I just eyeballed it, went, oh, that's about right. So I've just got that set up. And you want to use a marking knife for this. Try to hold it all so it doesn't move. It's not the most vital if this is not dead accurate, because this is the tail, so any discrepancies here will be transferred to the other side, so it doesn't matter too much. But we just want to hold it down as tight as we can. And so we obviously want to also square them across. Marking knife into the mark, and then, although it's not necessary, when I'm working with something this small, I like to have my referencing on both sides. So when we're working with little pieces like this, it can be very difficult to actually work with them. So I've got it in the vise here. This is okay for something this size. If you've got any smaller, you might want some other clamping method, like a wooden screw clamp or something to hold it a little bit higher up. Because this is plywood, you can still use a chisel to back cut, but I find it's less effective on the end grain of plywood, so you can actually try and get that clearance cut there if it's going to behave. Sometimes with plywood it doesn't. I'm using just my gent saw here. My saw's coming in and it's referencing there. You can see that it's not moving side to side because it's in that little V channel. So I'm making a little notch on both sides in that V channel. So now we've got our square across sorted. We then want to follow that angle. Now I'm going to follow the angle on my side, and it's going to be as close as I could get to the angle on your side. And we're going to follow that through until we hit the baseline. We need to go a little bit further on that side, and then this side. And now you guessed it, we've got to cut out these two little side pieces here. And And that's why I wanted to make sure that this was a nice deep reference line on the side here, because once again we can come back in with that chisel and hopefully it'll remove the material. If it doesn't, just bring your marking knife back in and just clean it up. Back in there again, you can see we're right on that baseline. Now you want to take this slow and just nibble your way down, and then if you cut through properly, the piece will come out like that, which is what you want. You can see that material come out. So one thing I haven't done is there's a little bit of material just in that bottom corner there, so you bring the chisel in on that dovetail angle, clean that up, bring your chisel down from this top edge, and that means we've got a nice tight corner there. And we want to repeat that on this side as well. Ensuring that everything is as square as we can get. Now, I can see just here, I don't know if you can see it on camera, I have slightly undercut my baseline, and I'm afraid that's kind of inevitable when doing this sort of stuff. You can try to avoid it as much as possible, but when working with stuff this small, the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. But I'm not saying I'm perfect, and I do make little mistakes. And it doesn't really matter, especially for something like this. Now I can see I've just got a little bit more material just on the top edge of my angle here on my dovetail that I didn't get. So I'm just going to run the chisel on that right at the top there. Now we're done. So now that we've got our tail done, we obviously need to transfer this onto our pin board, which is going to be our top board. Now for this, I'm going to get out my dovetail alignment jig, which really comes into its own when you're working with pieces as small as this, because trying to rest that on top and things is going to be so difficult with such a small piece. In order to do this, bring our jig inside our vise. So we want our vise to hold this piece. So we're referencing it up against the fence here and getting it flush on the top. So with these small pieces, I try and hold it flush, and then I will manipulate it once I've got it in here and sitting flush with the surface here. And then I'll put a little bit of pressure on the jaw vise here to hold it. And then I'm looking down here at my fence, ensuring that it's actually lined up where I want it, and then feeling for almost flush on the surface. It doesn't matter if it's out slightly. Then what we do is we bring our top piece in, and we can line it up where we want it here and do our marking like so. So now that that is here, we've obviously got that referenced against the fence, and I'm holding this shoulder here in line with this piece to make sure that it lines up. So you could look for this to be flush here. If you've undercut your shoulders a little bit, you can actually move it forward a little bit and make the dovetail a little proud, and then shave that back. But in this case, our shoulders are not too bad, so I'm lining them up with the side of this, and then making a couple of passes with the marking knife. We can see we've got these two dovetail lines just here. Now what we want to do is get the thickness of our plywood onto here and run our vertical lines straight down. So we don't need the dovetail alignment jig anymore. That's all we needed to do there, was just get that transfer. What we need is our marking gauge once again. Now this time we want to get the thickness of this top piece, so that comes on top. And we sit it there, let it drop. I'm going to lock the back one off. Then we bring it up and double check that it is the thickness we want, which it is in this case. I lock that one off, and then I like to bring that up so it doesn't move. Now we can grab our piece where we had our transfer, just there. And in this case, I'm just going to go right through on both sides. We don't need to do the ends because This is the pin, so we're keeping those end pieces and removing the middle piece. Now this is another tricky piece, is obviously transferring those lines down. So once again, I'm doing my best to eyeball from the top. I'll bring my knife in onto that, just so it references here. Run it down. While I've got my square in the correct spot, I'm going to take it to the other side. Then this side, up against the marking knife. Trying to keep that as square on the top of this as you can, because it's imperative that we get it as square as possible. And then this side, the last one, knife is in that line. We want to be a little more accurate with this one because we don't want to have gappy dovetails. So we want to try and get as close to that line as possible, but if you feel you need to saw just next to it and then pair it with a chisel, you can. However, if you are more experienced at doing this, you can saw right on that line and just take the line, and that will mean you've got a nice tight dovetail. So back down in the vise. So we're moving this piece just here. Our baseline is just there. I know it might be a little tricky to see on camera, so we want to cut on this central side, and I'm going to start by coming right up next to it as much as I can, right next to that line that I've just done. And I'm going to nibble it like so. I'm going to go to the other side and do the same while I'm in the same mode. I can get it as close as I can. Now we want to saw down to that baseline, following our straight line. So that line there, I've got one on my side. And then this side. Now we have to remove this piece just here. Now to do this, there's two ways we can use a coping saw. Considering how small this piece is, using a coping saw is not really going to be possible. So what I'm going to do is just chisel along here and remove this straight with a chisel. So let me get set up here with a scrap underneath and we'll remove that out. I like to have a slightly smaller chisel for this. So I'm coming in here and I'm going to sit about 2 millimeters off my line and give it a swift little tap, come across, do the same, then I'm going to turn it over, a couple of millimeters off again, now this time I need to go across a little bit further because this is the open side. And you've got to remember that you've got angles here, so you need to angle your chisel so you don't just cut straight into the pins here. I'm going to hold to the side of my piece, and you can put this in the vise if you want, and just back cut up against that chiseled line there. Trying to keep my fingers out of the way so I don't hit them, but I am at quite a steep angle, so there's not a lot of chance. So we can see we're taking a little recess out of there now. What we want to do is come back in and remove this piece entirely. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. You can see we've cracked it and it started to chop through. Now we just want to come here, and on this outside edge we want to angle it for the angle of this so we don't hit the pin. Come into this side, angle it in, and then right in the middle, and we want to remove this. And the last little bit. So in order to pair this, I like to go to my main bigger chisel. And we're going to go into that gauge line. And if anything, I'm going to angle it this way slightly, just so it's slightly undercut, so we're not left with a hump in the middle. Sometimes I find you end up going over the line a little bit. It's not the best, but with Jarrah you've got to have a super sharp chisel, and this is sharp, but sometimes it still undercuts the baseline ever so slightly. That's kind of a trial and error sort of thing. The more you do it, the more practice you get, but working with smaller pieces, I find it's a little easier to get inaccuracies there just because of how small and fine it is, and you're working with larger chisels and things on little tiny products, and it can cause little discrepancies that you don't really expect when you're working on larger stuff. I just want to bring this together to make sure that that is going to fit, and I can see that I've still got a pair a little bit off the top of the pin just here, and so I'm just going to clean up the side of these pins here. So I'm going to go straight in on my knife line on the top. Just pare it down. And then just clean up that bottom corner, because you want these corners to be nice and tight. And now we can do a quick fit, and we can see that that's actually come together absolutely perfect. There's a slight discrepancy just here, but you're probably not going to notice that in the final product. So now we obviously need to get our marks on here. So if we look at this, we've got it tapered. So we need to add these tapers to this piece before we put the dovetail together. Now you can do it after you put it together, but it's a little easier to do it before we put it together. So let's go ahead, and we need a dovetail square once again to get the correct angles on there. Mark them, and then we're going to use the shooting board to make sure they stay square to where we want. So I'm going to hang it off the end here. Reference my square on that top of that dovetail, and we want to go right to this top shouldered corner just here, as I said. And for this I'm going to use a pencil, because we're going to adjust this to make sure it goes in the way we want, and then turn it the other way. Cross right to the corner. Excuse my arm being in the way. Now we only need to put those markings on one side, and I can already see that I'm going to have to adjust this part a little bit past this line because it's not the same angle as the other side. So we're going to hold it, and we're going to remove this bigger chunk here to start with. So I'm just overhanging it. We're not keeping it square, we're just turning it as much as we need to try and get that angle matched. And you can see there now that our angle is almost exactly where we want it, so we can just follow it on this angle. Until it just takes the corner like that. So now we've got a square corner there. So I'm almost happy with that. I just want to take a little bit more down here. And now my line is gone, so we should be nice and square. So now we want to turn it the other way and do the other one. Now to get that first initial angle, I'm going to turn it the opposite way over here. just because it's a little easier to get the hand plane to work in this direction on this plywood. And it goes without saying here that we have a very fine set on this shooting plane because we don't want to blast anything out. We don't want to take too much at a time. Now I'm just trying to remove where my pencil is. So in order to double check this, we can hold it here against it like that. And we can see that those angles are pretty damn close. So now if we just fit it together like this, we can see that everything matches. If you did need to take a little bit off here so it matches perfectly, you can. But in this case, it looks like the alignment is perfect, so we're not going to have to worry about that. So now we want to go ahead and glue this together. For that, I'm just going to use a bit of thick CA glue and a little bit of activator. This is the 2P10. Any super glue and activator will work. I prefer the thick stuff for this because it just holds in the place and sets a little quicker and easier without it running. So let's go ahead and glue this together. Little dab there on the bottom, and on this we want to make sure that we've got it on here, there, and you don't want too much. That's the key to this. So then we're going to slide this together. You just want to make sure it's pushed in tight that way, and then hit the front so it sets that, hit the top, hit the back. And now we just want to let that dry for a few seconds. Let that activator flash off. So now what we want to do is grab a bit of sandpaper. We're going to smooth all these corners just with sandpaper because I don't want to take too much off. This plywood is a little brittle because it's got a thin veneer on the front, so we're just going to sand all these corners, and then I'm also going to sand the front here and the top here just to take any of that activator and super glue down, and so we get a nice flush finish to then put a nice flush surface to then put some finish on. So this is just a small piece of 240 grit sandpaper. Flatten that all out so you can see that's fairly flush. The dust is going into these gaps and just filling any little gaps. That's sitting fairly flush. The super glue is still there slightly because these pins were down a little lower than they should have been, which means that I probably had a little discrepancy just in the baseline of the dovetail. But once we put a finish on this, you're not even going to notice. So now what we want to do is just add those chamfers just by hand. So it's just the very corner we're hitting. We don't want to hit our referencing. Just these corners. Now, you can roll these bottom corners a little bit if the plywood's causing a few issues. And the final one is this one across here. We're just going to use a quick bit of 2-pound shellac here. So what we'll do is we'll just give that a few, I'm just going to sit it here, give it a few seconds to dry, and then I'll add another quick coat to it. So here we go, that's already flashed off and dried. Give that a few seconds to dry again, or a couple of minutes in this case. So now it's dry, I like just to cut the shellac back a little bit with a tiny bit of paste wax and a bit of steel wool. Evens the coating out. And there we go. Got this beautiful little dovetail jig. So let's jump over here into the vise and I'll show you how well it works. So you can use this with a pencil or with a knife. So you come up here, line it up. You can see we've got everything lined up pretty well here. Sometimes these can be out a little bit here, so you might just have to shave slightly off here to actually make that match, but in this case it's alright. And we can see we've got a nice dovetail there. If you want to see it with the knife. And we can see once again perfect alignment. And remember, this is a 1 in 6. So there you have it, folks. That's how you make a little dovetail jig, whether it's out of completely plywood or some more fancy timbers. You can see that you can make a fairly quick and easy project to make yourself your own dovetail jig, although it does require something to actually mark your lines. But that angle could be whatever you like, really. I don't think there's too much difference in the steeper and wider, just that you don't want to make them too upright, because then they're not going to have the strength that they require to actually do what you want in terms of the dovetail. So if you like this video and you'd like to keep supporting me, please consider liking and subscribing down below. And if you'd like to support me a little bit further, please consider checking me out on Patreon and Instagram. And if you'd like to see another great tool build video such as this one that you've seen here today, please check out the one up here where I create a wooden mallet, and also the intermediate woodworking series that this video will be part of. Bye for now.